Hi, I'm William Stewart, co-founder of Teleios. Welcome back to our verse-by-verse study on the book of Matthew. We're in chapter 14, beginning the third Galilean tour. Remember, Galilee is in the north of Israel, apart from the leadership of Israel, principally the Pharisees who were trying to kill Jesus. So, for freedom of movement out of faith, he goes and to talk to the people who would most want to hear him and respond, and away from the temptation of the Pharisees to have a chance to murder him, as time had not yet come, as John said. So he is around the Sea of Galilee, and he has just finished feeding the 5,000. Again, we're talking about another important miracle today. I'm going to summarize a lot of this and go over several lesson points. I'm sure you can think of items that I have not considered, but I'll try to give you a couple to get you started. Verse 22 in chapter 14, and straightway Jesus constrained the disciples to get into a ship and go before him unto the other side while he sent the multitudes away. So he sent the 5,000. He disperses everybody, including his disciples. And when he had sent the multitudes away, verse 23, he went up into a mountain apart and prayed. And when the evening was come, he was there alone. So this is twice in Jesus' ministry. He goes alone and prays on a mountain here, and in Luke 6, probably in relationship to choosing his disciples. Of course, he also prays in the Garden of Gethsemane, and in John 14, which may well be his prayer at Gethsemane. We're not quite sure. So from there, the disciples are out in the lake. Again, there's a storm, perhaps much like Matthew 8. And Christ, they are afraid, like Matthew 8. Christ comes this time walking on the water in the midst of the storm. Whereas in Matthew 8, he's asleep in the boat and wakes up, or the disciples wake him. So the disciples then become doubly afraid because they think there's a spirit of Christ on the water. So not biblical, not faithful. And then they understand that it's Christ, and that helps them. And then Peter wants to also come on the water, and Christ bids him to come. So in the middle of the storm, Peter walks out to Christ and then doubts and begins to sink. And Christ has to pull him up and says to him famously, "O thou of little faith, wherefore did you doubt?" And then the wind ceased, and I assume the storm at the same time. The response for this in verse 33, and they that were in the ship worshipped him proskuneo. Again, this is fall flat on your face type of worship. It's the type of worship in the Old Testament, the Gospels, in Revelation, past the church time, but it's not described for church-based believers. And I think, in a sense, worship by our service, from Romans 12, 1 and 2. And they said, "O thou art the Son of God," meaning basically you are God. When you said Son of God, in that culture, you are equal, alike, basically recognizing his deity. So compared to chapter 8, then, there's an extra measure of fear. So Christ pushed them because he came on the water. They thought that he was perhaps something different than what Christ is. So they lost perspective and faith there. Christ challenged, Peter wanted to walk to Christ. He allowed him to do this, I think, as an extension or a teaching or a challenge to his faith. Peter failed the test, as probably you and I would also, perhaps then noticing the storm around them and taking his eyes off Christ. And the response to this, Christ recognizes that he had failed, but I think Peter learned a lesson, and then they then worshipped him in uh, an appropriate way for the Old Testament and the Gospels and recognize his deity. So I think in this um, story that Christ is pushing Peter to make his faith more real and personal. Otherwise, typically Christ is taking care of the disciples, guarding them from persecution and evil while he's there on earth, so they're free to learn in a controlled environment. However, occasionally he does challenge them, like the two instances on the lake. And this time in Matthew 14, he pushes the limit more than in chapter 8. He sends them out to the cities with the message of the kingdom in Matthew 10. So, and of course, so after the beginning of the church in Acts, when the disciples finally have the Spirit and the regeneration, as it says in John 14, they'll be able to do so much more. The disciples were limited in their ability to understand what Christ was doing and had limited power because they didn't have that sort of regeneration in spirit to live the life that they would in the future. Okay, Peter walks in the water, fails in his faith, but Christ has challenged him. We think Peter has learned. They've recognized him as God. Again, another miracle where Christ shows his power and authority over nature. Thanks for joining me today. We'll continue in chapter 14 next time, another miracle, and as Christ shows his compassion and his power to the masses. I hope to see you then.